The morning sun spilled softly into the cafe, its golden light bouncing off polished counters, and the faint hiss of steaming milk filled the air as the smell of roasted coffee beans wrapped around the crowded space where hurried customers tapped. On laptops, checked emails, and waited impatiently for their orders. Among them, quietly sweeping the floor and wiping down tables, was a black woman named Grace, whose uniform was faded at the seams and whose shoes carried the cracks of years of wear, but whose spirit still carried a quiet dignity no hardship could erase. Her job was thankless, yet she performed it with precision, her hands moving in steady rhythm as though each table polished was a reflection of her resilience, each corner cleaned a silent prayer for better days. She had lived long in the shadow of poverty, raising her younger sister alone after their mother's passing, carrying bills like chains around her shoulders, and still she smiled because she believed kindness was the only wealth the world could never take from her. Most of the customers never noticed her presence except when she brushed past their chairs or when her rag squeaked across a spotless surface, yet she kept working, invisible yet indispensable. At the counter, a tall man in a crisp, tailored suit stepped forward. His jaw sharp, his wrist decorated with an elegant watch, his posture carrying the authority of someone who had walked through boardrooms more than cafes. He ordered a simple black coffee, his tone polite, but distracted, his eyes lost in thought, as though his mind belonged somewhere far away. When he pulled out his card and slid it across to the barista, the machine let out a shrill beep that broke the hum of the cafe. Declined. He frowned slightly, tried again and again. The same message glared back. The barista shifted impatiently, glancing at the line behind him, where customers muttered and sighed their judgment, pressing like weight against his shoulders. The man patted his jacket, his pockets, but found no other card, no wallet, no cash, and, for a moment, his polished confidence cracked, revealing a rare vulnerability. His ears burned with embarrassment, his throat tight as the murmurs grew around him, because in this place full of strangers, nothing cut deeper than humiliation. Grace looked up from the table she was wiping, and her heart clenched with recognition. For she knew that sting too well, the sting of being seen only through a moment of failure. Without a thought, she reached into the pocket of her uniform, pulling out a few crumpled bills she had tucked away from yesterday's wages, barely enough. For the bus ride home, yet enough for one cup of coffee. She stepped forward gently, her voice soft but steady, as she placed the money on the counter and said, "It is okay, I will pay for him." The cafe stilled for a heartbeat, the barista blinking in surprise, the man in the suit turning slowly his eyes, widening not at the money, but at the unexpected gesture. Grace's face held no pride, no expectation. She simply could not bear to watch another human face humiliation when she knew that pain intimately. She slid the rag back into her hand and returned to wiping the tables, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, her presence once again quiet in the background. The man accepted the coffee with a faint nod, still staring at her, his mind unsettled, because he had been rescued not by a peer, not by another polished patron, but by a woman who carried weariness in her posture and strength in her silence. Around them, the whispers shifted, no longer mocking, but stunned at the humility they had witnessed, though many quickly buried the thought and returned to their screens. But he could not return to anything. His eyes kept tracing her movements, her, bent back her steady hands, her quiet hum that carried through the cafe like a hymn. He sipped the coffee, slowly tasting not the bitterness of the brew, but the sweetness of her kindness, a taste that lingered deeper than any luxury he had ever known. To the rest of the cafe, she was invisible, a shadow in uniform, but to him, she had become something else entirely, a mirror that reflected a truth he had long forgotten. What no one knew, not the barista, not the customers, not even Grace, was that the man whose card had declined was not an ordinary stranger fumbling through his day. He was Alexander Ward, a billionaire CEO, whose empire stretched across industries, whose name commanded fear and respect in every boardroom, whose wealth insulated him from the smallest inconveniences of ordinary life. His assistant normally carried his wallet. His staff ensured every detail of his day was seamless, but a rare misstep had left him vulnerable in this cafe. And in that moment, it was not his billions, not his power, not his reputation that had saved him, but the crumpled bills of a cleaner who gave without hesitation. As he watched her disappear into the rhythm of her work, a realization settled in his chest, heavy and unshakable, that true wealth was not measured in the empire he had built, but in the humility she carried in her faded uniform. The coffee warmed his hands, but Alexander Ward felt no comfort because the cup itself had become a weight, a symbol of something he could not name, something he could not ignore as he sat at the corner table staring at the woman who had erased his humiliation with nothing but humility. Grace did not look his way. She moved steadily from table to table with her rag dipping into a small bucket of water. She carried her body swaying with tired grace as though each task had been rehearsed 1,000 times in her life. Customers came and went. Laptops clicked, espresso machines hissed, laughter rose and fell. Yet in the chaos he heard only the quiet rhythm of her work. The sound of rag against wood, the shuffle of her worn shoes, the soft hum that escaped her lips when she thought. No one listened. He had built empires upon precision strategies and profits, yet here in this cafe he found himself studying the simple mechanics of kindness, and it unsettled him more than the sharpest negotiation he had ever faced. When she disappeared into the back room carrying her bucket, he felt a sudden impulse to follow, but he restrained himself because the power he carried outside these walls meant nothing here, and he was a stranger in her world. Hours passed, yet he could not leave the cafe because his mind kept circling back to the moment she had placed her money down with no hesitation. Alexander was a man used to control every meeting planned, every decision calculated, every word weighed, yet here he was undone by a cleaner who acted without calculation or expectation. He had seen charity before he had signed checks with more zeros than she might see in a lifetime. But the charity of the wealthy was always seen, always acknowledged, always accompanied by applause or gratitude. Hers was different. It was invisible. It expected nothing. It was born not of excess, but of sacrifice, and that made it priceless. He sipped the last of his coffee, but the taste lingered differently now, because he knew he could not let this moment dissolve into memory. For years he had built walls around his life, insulating himself from the rawness of struggle, the messiness of ordinary existence, the sharp edge of vulnerability and failure. He lived in penthouses, traveled in private jets, dined where silver shone, brighter than the moon. And yet he realized that somewhere in those layers of privilege he had lost the ability to recognize humanity in its purest form. Grace had shattered that wall with nothing more than a few crumpled bills and the steady dignity in her eyes. The shame of being saved burned him, not because he was embarrassed, but because he had needed saving at all, and she had been the one to do it. For the first time in years, Alexander Ward felt small. But in that smallness, he discovered a clarity that humbled him. When Grace returned, her shift was almost over. Her steps slower, her hands aching, yet she smiled faintly as the barista cracked a joke while closing the register. She wiped down one last table, stacked the chairs, and washed her rag before tucking it neatly into her bucket. She counted her tips, mostly coins and a few small bills, sliding them carefully into her pocket as though each one mattered, and indeed it did, because every dollar would stretch into food, into rent, into school supplies for her sister waiting at home. She did not notice Alexander still seated in the corner, his eyes following her like a man haunted by a revelation. When she finally removed her apron and folded it across her arm, she stepped into the night air, her shoulders slumping slightly, as though the darkness itself carried her weight. Alexander rose almost instinctively, leaving his untouched laptop behind his polished shoes, clicking against the floor as he followed her outside. The evening was cool, the city buzzing with horns and neon lights flickering across cracked sidewalks. Grace walked quickly, her bucket clutched at her side, her gaze fixed ahead as though each step was calculated to reach home before exhaustion consumed her. Alexander kept a distance, unsure of what he was doing, unsure of what words could possibly bridge the gulf between a billionaire and a cleaner whose worlds were divided by walls of money and circumstance. Yet he knew he could not simply disappear back into his empire, not after what had happened, not after she had given him a glimpse of a truth that could not be bought. He watched as she boarded a bus, its faded paint peeling its windows fogged with breath. And he realized she was retreating into a life he could not even imagine, a life far removed from the glass towers where his name carried weight. And in that moment, a decision formed, sharp and unshakable in his mind, that he would not allow this encounter to fade into a passing story. She had saved him in the smallest way, and in return, he would change her life in the largest way imaginable, though she did not yet know it. The bus rattled along the worn city streets, its seats patched with tape, its windows rattling with every bump. Yet for Grace it was a familiar lullaby, one she had endured for years as she carried herself home after long shifts at the cafe. She clutched the bucket tightly on her lap, her apron folded neatly on top, her mind already drifting toward the evening ahead where her younger sister Layla waited in their small one-bedroom apartment. Grace thought about the bills stacked on the table, thought about the rent notice taped to their door, thought about the half-filled fridge where groceries stretched thin across weeks, and yet she also thought about the way Layla's laughter lit up their dark little space, and she smiled faintly because for her love had always outweighed despair. She had not spared much thought for the stranger in the cafe except a vague hope that he had not been too embarrassed by what happened. For her, it was nothing extraordinary, just another small act of kindness in a world that often forgot kindness even existed. She stared out of the bus window at the blur of neon and shadow, and for a moment allowed herself to breathe free of the weight she carried. Alexander followed the bus in his sleek black car, its engine humming quietly as though reluctant to announce its presence. He had instructed his driver to keep a careful distance, his eyes never leaving the faded yellow bus as it wound through the city's arteries into neighborhoods his kind rarely entered. For the first time in years, he was seeing his city stripped of gloss and polished glass towers replaced by crumbling brick buildings, cracked sidewalks, children playing with worn basketballs under flickering streetlights, and mothers clutching grocery bags that looked too heavy for their frames. Each detail struck him with the force of revelation, because in the boardrooms where numbers ruled, none of this existed in the spreadsheets and projections that defined his empire. Yet here, it was raw and undeniable, and he realized that Grace's life unfolded in these streets every single day, while his unfolded in worlds detached from such struggle. The distance between them was not just economic, it was almost cosmic, and yet tonight he felt closer to her than to anyone in his vast empire. When Grace stepped off the bus, Alexander instructed his driver to stop a block away so as not to draw attention. He watched as she walked toward a crumbling building, whose paint peeled in long strips, whose stairs groaned under her weight, and whose dimly lit hallway flickered with dying bulbs. She climbed slowly, her bucket still at her side, her posture weary yet steady, as though she had learned to carry burdens without complaint. Alexander remained in the car, his chest heavy, his jaw clenched, his mind caught between awe and shame, because he realized the woman who had saved him, with a single act of kindness, lived in conditions he would never wish upon anyone. He had seen poverty from a distance in reports, in charity galas, in glossy photographs presented for donations, but seeing it now through the window of his car, connected to the woman who had humbled him earlier that day, struck him deeper than anything ever had. He whispered almost to himself, "We cannot leave her like this, and his driver glanced at him through the mirror, puzzled, but said nothing, because he had learned long ago that when Alexander Ward decided something, it was not a passing thought, it was a command written into stone. Inside her apartment, Grace set the bucket aside and was greeted by Layla's excited hug, her sister's thin arms wrapping around her waist, her eyes glowing with joy despite the dim light and the cracked walls that surrounded them. Grace crouched low, brushing back Layla's hair, listening as the girl recited stories from school, her small voice filling the space with warmth that money could not measure. They sat together on the floor, sharing the simple meal Grace had prepared. Earlier, rice and beans seasoned with love rather than luxury. Grace listened intently, laughed when Layla laughed, nodded when she spoke, and for that hour she was not a cleaner, not a woman buried under bills, but simply a sister, holding on to the one thing she cherished above all else. Outside, however, Alexander remained parked on the street, staring up at the small apartment window where faint shadows danced across the thin curtains. He felt like an intruder into her world, yet at the same time he felt drawn, compelled, as though fate itself had guided him into this moment. The thought of driving away felt unbearable because leaving would mean discarding the revelation she had given him, and he could not. As the night deepened, Alexander finally returned to his penthouse, where glass walls framed the glittering skyline, and every luxury surrounded him, yet none of it felt the same. The silence echoed more sharply. The polished marble felt colder. The opulent paintings on his walls looked emptier. He poured himself a drink, but it tasted hollow. His leather chair felt stiff, his grand view meaningless. For the first time in his life, Alexander Ward, the billionaire CEO, the man who owned towers across the city and commanded respect in every room, felt poor. Not poor in wealth, but poor in spirit, poor in humanity, poor in the richness of heart that Grace had shown him without hesitation. He leaned back, closing his eyes, but sleep eluded him because her face, her gesture, her quiet dignity replayed in his mind until it became unbearable. When the dawn finally broke, spilling gold across his sterile penthouse, Alexander knew without doubt that his next step was inevitable. He would find her not as a benefactor, not as a savior seeking gratitude, but as a man who owed his own soul a debt of humanity. And when he found her again, he would make sure she never carried the weight of survival alone ever again. The following morning, Grace returned to the cafe, her uniform freshly washed, though faded, her shoes polished as best as she could manage, her hair tied back neatly, because dignity was the one luxury she could afford without cost. She moved with her usual rhythm, wiping tables, serving customers, taking orders with a smile, even as her body ached from lack of rest. To her, it was just another day, another small battle in the endless war of survival. But to Alexander, it was the beginning of something far greater. He entered quietly dressed, not in his tailored suits, but in simple clothing, chosen to make him appear ordinary, because he wanted to be seen not as a figure of power, but as the same man whose card had failed the night before. When Grace noticed him standing in line, her heart paused for a beat, recognizing the stranger, yet not fully understanding why he had returned. She offered him a polite nod and a gentle smile before turning to clean the counter, and he felt again that sting of humility that she carried her kindness without needing recognition. He ordered coffee and took a seat at the corner table, his eyes following her movements as though memorizing every detail. The steady way she carried her tray, the soft words she offered to customers, the patience she showed even when treated poorly. When she finally approached his table to wipe it down, he looked up and spoke softly. "You helped me yesterday, and I have not forgotten." She paused her rag in mid-motion, her eyes widening slightly before she shook her head lightly and replied, "Was nothing, sir. Anyone would have done the same." But Alexander knew that was not true. He had lived in a world where kindness was often measured, where help came with conditions, where generosity was rarely given freely. Yet here she stood, dismissing her act as ordinary when he knew it had been extraordinary. He leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. It was not nothing. Grace, it meant more than you know. She blinked at the sound of her name, realizing he had noticed her name tag, and for a moment an unease stirred within her, because she was not used to men like him remembering women like her. The day wore on, but Alexander did not leave. He remained, seated, laptop closed, phone untouched, simply watching her work, as if searching for pieces of her life in every gesture. When her break finally came, she sat alone at a small table in the back, sipping water from a worn plastic bottle, nibbling on bread she had brought from home. Alexander approached, slowly asking if he might sit, and though hesitation flickered in, her eyes she nodded out of politeness. They spoke lightly at first about the cafe, the long shifts, the customers, but gradually his questions turned deeper, not invasive, but curious about her life, her family, her dreams. Grace answered cautiously, revealing only pieces, yet even those fragments painted a picture of struggle, resilience, and sacrifice that struck him harder than any boardroom negotiation. She spoke of her sister Layla, her desire to see her through, school her hope that one day life might ease even a little. She did not complain. She did not beg. She simply spoke with quiet strength, and he listened with the intensity of a man hearing truth for the first time in years. By the time her shift ended, rain had begun to fall outside, the streets glistening under the gray sky. Alexander offered to drive her home, but she shook her head firmly, insisting she was fine because she had learned long ago not to depend on strangers, no matter how kind they appeared. He respected her refusal, though it unsettled him, and so he followed her again, at a distance, his car trailing the bus through wet streets. When she arrived at her building, soaked but smiling faintly as she greeted a neighbor, he remained in his car, his heart twisting tighter with each passing second. He knew now that his life could not return to its former rhythm, that meeting her had shifted something irreversibly inside him. He would not impose, he would not force his way into her world, but he would find a way to honor the debt her kindness had written into his soul. And as he sat in the shadows, watching her climb the stairs into her fragile little world, he whispered to himself, "Tomorrow everything changes for her." That night, he drafted plans long into the early hours, not of profit or expansion, but of transformation. He reviewed properties in her neighborhood, considering renovations. He studied scholarships. He reviewed employment opportunities. He even contacted a foundation he rarely involved himself with. Each action was deliberate, each decision fueled not by pity, but by a desire to restore balance, because he understood that wealth was meaningless if it could not heal the fractures of a life like hers. For the first time, his empire became more than numbers and glass towers. It became a weapon for good, a bridge to lift someone who had lifted him without knowing it. He had faced countless negotiations across the world, but this was the first time. The stakes felt human, the first time victory meant more than profit. And as dawn broke once more across his glass penthouse, Alexander Ward smiled quietly because he knew what tomorrow would bring, and he knew Grace's life would never be the same again. The cafe buzzed the next morning, filled with chatter and clinking cups. But for Grace, it was just another day, another quiet fight to keep her dignity alive, one small shift at a time. She moved through the crowd, focused, determined, her apron tied. Snug her eyes, tired but warm. Yet there was an unusual stir near the door, whispers rippling through the room as heads turned toward the man who had just walked in. This time Alexander Ward did not arrive dressed down or quiet. He entered in his tailored suit, flanked by two associates, though his presence was not cold or commanding, but purposeful. He walked directly to the counter where Grace stood frozen, rag in hand, heart pounding, because suddenly she realized the stranger she had helped, the man whose card had failed, was no ordinary customer. A murmur spread through the cafe. Someone whispered his name, and the sound carried like a spark through dry grass. Billionaire CEO Alexander Ward. Grace's hands trembled, her mind unable to grasp the reality unfolding before her, as his eyes locked onto hers, filled not with arrogance but gratitude. He asked her softly but firmly to join him outside, and though her legs felt unsteady, she followed the weight of curious eyes pressing against her back. On the street, rain clouds hung low, yet the world seemed to pause as he turned to her and spoke words that would forever etch themselves into her memory. "Yesterday you paid for my coffee when I had nothing to offer. Today I stand before you with everything to give." Her breath caught her lips parted, but no words formed as he continued, his voice steady, but threaded with emotion. "You did not know who I was. You did not care. You gave because you are kind. That kind of humanity cannot go unnoticed." He stepped closer, lowering his tone so that only she could hear. "I have seen your world, and I cannot allow you to carry it alone anymore." Then, with a subtle gesture, he motioned to the black car parked by the curb, and within moments, Layla appeared guided gently by one of his associates, her young eyes wide in wonder, her small hands clutching a new backpack filled with books. Grace gasped, rushing to her sister's side, clutching her tightly, her tears falling freely as Alexander looked on. The crowd that had gathered outside whispered in disbelief as Alexander revealed more. He announced that Layla's education would be fully funded through the finest schools and universities, that Grace herself would no longer work nights scrubbing floors, because he had created a position for her within his foundation, a role built to honor her strength and resilience. The cafe workers stepped out, the passers-by leaned closer, everyone stunned at the sight of a billionaire bending his empire toward a single act of kindness repaid 100-fold. Grace stood speechless, her sister's small arms wrapped around, her waist, her own chest heaving with the weight of gratitude and shock. She tried to refuse, shaking her head, saying softly, "I cannot accept this. It is too much." But Alexander lifted his hand, stopping her words with a quiet firmness. "You must accept it, Grace, because the world owes you this. You reminded me of humanity when I had forgotten it. This is not charity. This is justice." Tears blurred her vision as she looked at him, seeing not the billionaire CEO the newspapers praised, not the man whose towers scraped the heavens, but the stranger whose card had failed in a cafe, whose humility had revealed his truest self. She whispered, "Thank you, though." The words felt small against the enormity of his gift, and he shook his head gently, replying, "No, Grace, thank you." For the first time in years, Alexander felt the walls within him break, the walls built by wealth, by power, by detachment. In that moment, he was not a CEO, not a man of fortune, but simply a human being touched by another. The cafe that had once held nothing more than passing strangers now stood as the birthplace of a story that would ripple far beyond its doors. For Grace, life would never again be confined to survival for Layla. The horizon had opened wide, and for Alexander, a single act of kindness had rewritten the meaning of his empire. As the sun broke through the clouds, scattering light across the wet streets, Grace held her sister's hand tightly, her tears glistening like diamonds in the morning glow. Alexander stood beside them, silent but steady. No longer a stranger, but something more. A bridge between two worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart, until fate stitched them together over a cup of coffee. The crowd slowly dispersed, whispers lingering in the air. But Grace remained still, her eyes lifted toward the sky as though searching for the God who had finally heard her prayers. She realized then that sometimes miracles arrived not with thunder, not with fire, but with something as simple as a declined card and a cup of coffee. And as she walked forward, her sister's laughter echoing by her side, and Alexander's presence a quiet promise behind her, she knew with certainty that her life had shifted forever. She was no longer just a cleaner, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten. She was Grace, and her kindness had changed the world.